Hello, and welcome to Denton's Tales. In this video, I shall be continuing my look at the great goddess Freyja. And this is rather a nice little representation of her, I think, showing her with her cats and her name here in runes. That is quite decorative, I think. I should just put it down there. Now, we left part one of this video discussing Freyja's possible role with the Valkyria, the oh-so-romantic flying warrior women tasked with transporting dead heroes to Ásgarðr, and then making their very long-term residence there in Valhall, the great hall of the warriors slain in battle, as pleasant as possible, serving them with a never-ending supply of roast boar and mead, and probably providing personal services of a, intimate nature, being friendly, you might say. Yeah, you get the idea. Another indication of Freyja's possible link with the Valkyria are two of the alternate names given for her, as I mentioned in part one, and they are Vanadis and Valfreyja. Since Dis means a lower form of a god, a demigod, if you like, and Vana comes from Vanir, the family of gods from which Freyja comes. So the name means the Dis or demigoddess of the Vanir, a name that suggests a lower form of her status, not a full goddess. But the Valkyria themselves are also not goddesses. I mean, some of them are actually human or giants, but they are seen as similar to demigoddesses due to their position and their duties. And a lot of people might consider them to be demigoddesses by their status, if nothing else. So again, there is a link between Freyja and the Valkyria, a full goddess in one way, but perhaps a demigoddess in another as a Valkyria. She might even be seen as the Valkyria of the Vanir. And the other name has a much more direct connection, since it means the lady of the warriors slain in battle. Val being a word that means specifically a warrior who dies in combat, from which, of course, we get the words Valkyria, the choosers of the warriors slain in battle, and Valhall, the hall of the warriors slain in battle, as well as the Valgundr, the wall that surrounds the realm of the dead, hell, the wall of the warriors slain in battle. And Freyja's name means lady. She is the lady, a name and a title. So Valfreyja means the lady of the warriors slain in battle. So these two names could be taken as an indication of Freyja's connection in some way with the Valkyria, whether directly as riding to battle with them, taking part in dead warrior collecting herself, or simply receiving her share of the dead warriors when they are brought to Valhall. We simply can't say for certain because those things are not specifically stated. On the subject of her name, Wiccans can relate to her very, very easily, since they have the Lord and the Lady. And Freyja's name means the Lady, while her brother, Freyr, his name means the Lord. So together they are the Lord and the Lady. Another link to the Valkyria could well be her ability to fly and the method she used to do so. Now, they are mentioned as putting on what are described as swan suits, some form of garment made of or at least covered with swan feathers, though we don't know anything much more about it than that. It is simply mentioned. There are no great descriptions of exactly what it was, but it seems likely that it had something to do with their ability to fly, given that they seem to be putting them on in order to go and do something. More so when we consider Freyja. She is mentioned as having a cloak or a garment of hawk or falcon feathers, featherskin it's called, which enables her to fly. And she has no problem lending this garment to other gods, even to Loki, who borrows it on one occasion himself to take her falcon shape, as he calls it, seeming to imply that not only does it enable her to fly, but it can also transform her into the actual form of a hawk or a falcon. So the Valkyria can fly and have something made of swan feathers. Freyja can fly and has something made of hawk feathers. There is an obvious possible connection between the two, something giving the ability to fly that is or has feathers on it. And perhaps Freyja's having hawk feathers was merely a symbol of her rank, the hawk or falcon seen as a superior bird to the swan. It might also be noted that Freyja rode a boar, whose name was Hildisvini, which means battle swine. Why a battle swine? Boars don't really join in battles very often, if at all. In fact, never. A further reference to combat regarding her. She doesn't just ride a boar, she rides one specifically referred to as a battle one. And that, I think, does seem to indicate a connection with battles, warfare in some form in her case. As well as flying around with her hawk feather garment and riding on her boar, Hildisvini, Freyja also travelled in a chariot drawn by two tomcats, as I mentioned. And in fact, she is stated to have driven to the funeral of Balder in her cat-drawn conveyance. Why cats and not horses, or even boars for that matter? Well, it's fitting, I suppose, since from ancient Egypt onwards, cats have been associated with femininity and fertility. Bast, the cat goddess of Egypt, for example. And since they are tomcats, and they are pulling the goddess representing all things female, perhaps, combined with Freyja herself, it was a representation of the male-female requirement for reproduction. We know nothing about Freyja's cats, apart from the fact that she had them and they pulled her chariot. But perhaps we should think of them as a much larger version of the skulk cat, the forest cat, which we know as a rule as the Norwegian forest cat, a popular pet among the Old Norse, and the largest domestic cat you can get. A very important aspect of Freyja is her role as a Volva, the singular form of Volva, as those women who practice Seiðr, the Norse form of shamanic ritual, were known. The name meaning a wand carrier or one who carries a magic staff. And in fact, she may be regarded as the first Volva, having brought that magic art to Ásgarðr when she joined the Aesir gods there. The practice said to have been common, of course, among the Vanir gods, the Vanir, of course, having fought with magic during the war between the gods. Cedar was a shamanic form of magic, often involving the study of fate, and working within that to not only understand it, but also perhaps to alter it, symbolically weaving a new set of events. And the Volva could actually weave something like that, unlike the Norns, who are, of course, always seen as weaving fate. In fact, they didn't. They carved it on sticks. And this type of magic could be applied to virtually any aspect of life, and some aspects of it, in fact, still exist in modern shamanism in various countries. It was a form of magic that could give blessings, or it could tell the future, it could cure the sick, assist the growing of crops, and even bring good weather. But, oh yes, there's always a but, it could also do the exact opposite. It could bring curses, cause illness, kill livestock, cause injury or death, especially in battle, and it could give false prophecy, so people would make the wrong decisions. That a Volva using her magic in an unacceptable way was truly believed in is shown by the fact that in Iceland, love poems, those things so dear to Freyja herself, were actually banned, since a spell might be placed in them to force someone to love a person against their will, which of course would be very undesirable. A Volva was essentially a seeress, a sorceress, sometimes called a knowing woman for that reason, often travelling around from hall to hall or village to village with her wand, performing her Seiðr magic in return for food and lodging and other forms of compensation. And they bore no relation whatsoever to the seer portrayed in the television show Vikings. Oh, dear me no. Blinded and rather resembling an animated Egyptian mummy. Why they made him reminiscent of something that was dug up in the Valley of the Kings is rather hard to understand. And he is, of course, a man. Though it might be rather hard to tell under all that makeup. Something I'll come to in a moment, but it is quite relevant. A Volva was both respected and feared during the Viking Age, and for centuries before that, able to travel even at night, alone and unarmed, anywhere in perfect safety. No one would dare to touch her. Nobody, at least, who wanted their crops not to fail, or their cattle to die, or stop giving milk. And when she would visit a hall, the owner, be he a powerful jarl or even a king, would give up his seat to her. Special meals would be provided for her. She would be treated as a VIP, as we would call it today. A Volva could also go to war, accompanying an army to provide magic assistance. Now, it was seen as women's work, and though there were a few men who practiced the art, they ran the risk of being considered, well, less than manly, and even being persecuted. For example, during the Christianization of Norway, Seiðr particularly annoyed King Olaf Tryggvason. Not that he liked any pagans for that matter, and he was rather easily annoyed, but men doing women's work, oh, I mean, that really pissed him off. And he had them bound and tossed onto a rocky outcrop in the sea at low tide, there to drown slowly when the tide came back in, just to show them how pissed off he really was. And believe me, Olaf was pissed off. And I would say as the water rose around them, they probably got that message. The rather amusing thing, though, about all that is that the most famous man to practice Cedar was none other than Odin himself, the king of the gods, who was taught it by Freyja at his own request. And even Odin, suffered the accusations of being unmanly as a result. Now, personally, if I lived in an age where heroic manly prowess was so greatly admired, and I knew a man who went around on a massive eight-legged horse and carried a spear that when he threw it couldn't miss and then returned to his hand, I would be very slow to tell him he wasn't manly, even if he was wearing a blonde wig with pretty little curls in it and a pink dress covered in flowers while sitting on the floor playing with dolls. No, keep it shut. Loki, of course, accused Odin of being ergi, or effeminate, for learning Seiðr from Freyja, rather overlooking the fact, of course, that he had intimate relations with a male horse while in the form of a female horse, and became pregnant, later giving birth to a foal, which was about as female as any man could possibly be. I mean, how many men have ever given birth? Like, well, none, actually, except Loki, of course. Technically, I suppose he was female at the time, since he was a mare, so maybe he doesn't count? You decide on that one. Just like the Greeks and the Romans and the peoples of the Middle East, the Norse saw pictures in the sky made up of various stars. And to them, Freyja was represented in the night sky by the brilliant constellation we now know as Orion the Hunter, visible during the winter months, particularly nice during January, or in the summer from the southern hemisphere. The entire star group was known as Freyja's gown, though also sometimes as Friggs, and the famous belt of Orion was called Freyja's girdle or Freyja's distaff, though again sometimes also as Friggs. The distaff used in spinning, of course, representing the Volva's staff or wand. And this consists of three very bright stars, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, and they lie at an angle to the rest of the constellation, roughly in the middle, hence the belt or girdle reference. Now, these stars are huge. Alnitak, for example, is 20 times the diameter of our sun and vastly luminous. But of course, they look like tiny little dots of light simply because they lie a great many hundreds of millions of miles away. If they were close to us, well, there wouldn't be any night, each of them being thousands of times more luminous than the sun. And if our sun, so bright, of course, as we see it, because it happens to be very close to us, lay at the same distance that they do, it would be so faint you couldn't even see it. But anyway, enough of that. This is not a talk on astronomy, after all. Friday takes its name either from Freyja or from Frigg. There are conflicting versions. It's either Freyja's Day or Frigg's Day. But that, of course, could bring us back to the possibility that early in Norse religion, the two goddesses were one and the same, or the result of confusion later on, or just that later devotees of each of them picked their own favourite for the honour. Like many other things, there's really no way to say that conclusively, because we don't really have any first-hand account from the Viking Age. Our great problem is that, but we have with Norse religion and religious practices, is that our records date from long after the gods, or Ásgarðr, had given way to the new faith of Christianity. Snorri Sturluson, for example, the writer of the Prose Edda, lived 200 years after Iceland had been converted. And his writings, though he cared about the old stories and the sagas, and he wanted to preserve them and that style of literature, they are influenced by Christian thinking. In some places, Norse conversion to the new faith had been mostly peaceful, based mainly on intermarriage and mutual acceptance of the peoples they lived among, as happened here in Ireland very, very prominently, where where intermarriage and all this came about very quickly, and the conversion to the new faith. But that was not the same elsewhere. In Norway, for example, King Olaf Tryggvason, a charming man I've already mentioned, and his very gentle and pleasant ways, he made it his business. He made it his business to save the souls of his people from the dreadful and evil influence of pagan beliefs by torturing or killing anyone who didn't agree with him, destroying pagan temples and artifacts, and driving those who clung to the old gods underground. Writers like Snorri would probably have been very wise to play down or alter aspects of pagan belief, making them more acceptable, making them less pagan, and of course not suggesting that they approved of it, of course, oh no, no, and not going into detail, for example, about the actual words used in pagan ceremonies, lest the church saw that as giving instruction on devil worship. Something like that, of course, could get you invited to a barbecue in the town square, only you were the barbecue. Unfortunately, the Norse people in pre-Christian times never wrote books, though they could have easily enough using their system of runes, but they didn't. All their history and religion, all their sagas were verbal, recounted by storytellers called skalds, or, of course, by ordinary people to pass the time sitting around the fire. The Eddas were written in the 13th century, making them second-hand accounts, even where they seem largely unaltered, and often somewhat questionable. But there's nothing we can do about that, of course, other than keeping it in mind when reading the written accounts, cross-checking with other accounts by later travellers, and of course the customs of similar peoples in that region, like the Sami and other Slavic peoples to the east. But, it makes reconstructing what a Volva would have done very, very difficult. We don't have the script, you could say. It would be like, trying to recreate the play Hamlet by knowing that his father was killed, he likes to talk to skulls, you've got these few little details, but you're not going to reconstruct the play. We often know what they did, such as being lifted up, for example, to look over something to see into the future. Something that is actually done in the Northman movie, which I was quite delighted to see. I've never seen it done in any other movie, but it is correct. But, we don't know how they did it. We don't know what was said, what incantations were used. For example, Odin tells us that he knows 18 spell songs and what they do, which is wonderful. But he doesn't tell us the words, so we can't do them. Was that the likes of Snorri or Saxo deliberately leaving that out for obvious reasons, not wanting to be accused of giving people methods of contacting the devil? Or perhaps did the old skalds not even recite them, as they were magic? We really have no way of knowing, but it means that we could do a medieval mass quite easily because we have the script, but we can't do a full, proper Volva ceremony because we have no idea what was said, and so forth. For example, we are told that special songs were sung. Well, what were they? What were the words? So in something like that, we could make up a song, fine, there's a Volva singing a song, but it is not the actual song that a Volva would have sung. So this makes reproducing these things extremely difficult. I have a personal story concerning Freyja, which is this. My granddaughter took 2 kittens from a feral litter that had been rescued, and she named them Tommen and Hodor. Yes, she's a Game of Thrones fan. Now, they've always been totally house cats. They have their living quarters, they have a cat tower and beds, and they spend most of their time sleeping on the stair carpet or any other comfortable place they can find. They are cats, and cats are very good at finding comfortable places. Now, early one evening, there was no sign of Tommen, though Hodor was wandering around the house looking a bit lost. And I went to see, if he was asleep in the cat tower. The top light of the bathroom window was pushed up, and no Tommen. He'd gone out the window. Instant panic. Now, he'd never been outside the house. Neither of them had. They had no street skills, if you like, no knowledge whatsoever of anything outside the house. And we realized he'd been gone for quite some time. We went out in the garden, calling his name and shaking bags of cat treats, which always brought him running. Even if he'd been asleep, he would have come at the sound of the treats, but nothing. we toured the district, calling and shaking the bags of treats, and we must have been out in the garden every 10 minutes or so, but no sign of him. Now, my granddaughter was distraught. Hours and hours went by, nobody went to bed, and we couldn't have slept if we'd wanted to. It had passed 3 o'clock in the morning, and we'd pretty much given up hope of seeing him again. We were still touring the district, as I said, shaking bags of treats and calling his names. Now, I went to the altar that I have dedicated to Freyja. You can just see a little bit of it there, and some of these statuettes that are, in fact, on it. I said something like, "Freyja, great goddess of the vineyard, you were associated with cats. Cats, pull your chariot. Help us. Please bring Tommen home safe." And I went back downstairs, and Tommen jumped in through the still open bathroom window. I leave you to decide on that. So that almost concludes this look at the bright goddess Freyja, the greatest and most respected, honoured and loved goddess of the Norse pantheon, the very symbol of everything good that is feminine, invoked in prayer and with a blot or sacrifice by many generations of Norse women for her aid in romantic matters, to give fertility and protect the newborn, to make life better and more enjoyable for women in particular. Whether you see her in her sensual, romantic role, armoured and riding into battle with the Valkyria, or just driving around in her cat chariot, she is a compelling and attractive figure, hardly inferior to Odin and Thor in her grandeur. On the final and fitting note, Freyja is mentioned in the first stanza of Denmark's civil national anthem. Yes, Denmark has more than one. There's the royal anthem played for the royal family or on military occasions. It's called King Christian Stood by the Battle Mast. And there's a civil anthem called There Is a Lovely Country. The royal anthem is played on its own as a rule for state events, but often both of the anthems are played for other things. And the first stanza goes like this. There is a lovely country, it stands with broad beech trees. Near the salty eastern shore it bends itself in hill, valley. Its name is Old Denmark, and it is the Hall of Freyja. So, with that, I shall say farewell, and hope to see you in the next video. Goodbye for now.